chance of feedback from ambient earpieces. These measures are in place so that we can conduct our business without interruption and to protect the health and safety of all participants, particularly our interpreters. Appreciate your cooperation in that regard. Now, as we get into the meeting, I just wanted to make it official. We'll be here for 1 hour. We had scheduled committee business for the second hour. However, with a large number of substitutes in this session, we've decided to hold committee business over to Monday, when there'll be ample time to, first of all, provide drafting instructions on this study, as well as to deal with where the committee wants to go next. So speaking of substitutes, we have MP Blaney for MP McPherson, MP Ellis for MP Couric, MP Talmy for MP Chong. Well, that would be the second hour, which we're not going to have. Mr. Cooper is here for Ms. Landsman. Mr. Longfield is here for MP Erskine Smith. And I think that does it for, and Mr. Nakvi, of course, for Rob Oliphant. So, we're taking place in a hybrid format as usual these days. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. So I ask you to please wait till I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of the screen for either Floor, English, or French. And for those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can. Now, per the motion adopted on March 26, 2024, we're hearing testimony in relation to the matters revealed in the Winnipeg lab documents. I'd now like to welcome our witness for today's meeting, Mr. Richard B. Fadden. Mr. Fadden, you have up to 5 minutes to deliver some opening remarks.
Thank you, Chair. In the hope that it might be useful to you, I'd like to make or offer a few contextual remarks about departmental security generally. I make these comments drawing both on my national security experience and on my experience in, I think, 8 departments while I was still working. Outside of core national security departments and agencies, departmental security, absent a crisis, is not a priority. It would not engage the attention of deputy heads and certainly not of ministers. In these non-national security core departments, it's policy, operations, or science that get attention, not security, or for that matter, any other matter relating to corporate issues, finance. As long as people are paid, they're not happy, they're not going to spend a lot of time worrying about finance or procurement or things of that nature. Having worked in 2 science-based departments, I think this is especially true of science and scientists. They are not particularly interested in security. I'm not ascribing ill intent on either departmental security or scientists, but rather disinterest and insufficient training and resources, which can lead to security violations, some minor, some serious. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that most departmental security units are not equipped to deal with significant national security issues. If, for example, you're in a department like Heritage Canada, you don't worry about national security, even if there is a threat there, because people move around. You are, to some degree, like a medium-sized city general-purpose police officer. You don't have national security training, and I think that's a problem increasingly today. Additionally, I think the overall national security environment has an impact on how seriously departmental security can carry out their duties or are equipped or resourced to do so. And in Canada, over the last few decades, I think it's fair to say that the national security environment has not been consistent, especially as concerns China. So if you're a departmental security officer wondering about how seriously you should apply rules and whatnot, you find comfort in the fact, I think, that up and down the system, nobody is jumping up and down and telling you to do things very, very seriously. All of the above is not to suggest that I disagree with the final decisions taken at the Winnipeg lab concerning the 2 scientists. Rather, I wanted to try and paint a bit of a picture that I think still applies today in most departments. It's a significant both cultural and resource issue, and I think it's indicative of a serious systemic range of issues that I hope that the committee might be able to deal with, not only in respect of labs, but also departments and agencies generally. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fadden. We'll now go to our rounds of questionings, and we'll begin with Mr. Cooper for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Fadden, for appearing. One of the things that struck me about this national security breach in terms of how it was handled was the length of time that it took between when red flags were first raised in August of 2018 to the time that these two scientists were let out of the lab on July 5th of 2019. That's almost a year. And during that time, these scientists had unfettered access to the lab, even after a fact-finding report was issued in March. Although it was incomplete, it validated that they were, among other things, transferring on an unauthorized basis materials from the lab to the PRC, and that there were multiple security and intellectual property breaches of policy. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on the issue of the timeline in terms of how PAC responded.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I think my general purpose reaction is that the time frame allowing them full access was too long. I don't think necessarily that when the red flags were first raised, they should have been handcuffed and walked out of the building. But there were a range of measures that departmental security and the deputy head could have taken to restrict their access, to control where they're going and whatnot. And I think it became increasingly clear, certainly in terms of the material I've read, as time went on, it was more and more serious. And they also could have made the conditions to which they were subjected more serious as time went on. So my bottom line is their general access, their unfettered access until almost the very end was too long. And at a bare minimum, they should have had, if they were to remain on the job, had their physical access restricted and had perhaps electronic access restricted. You don't have to cut somebody off entirely in order to limit the threat they pose.
It has been my contention that upon the issuance of that fact-finding report, that immediately thereafter, steps should have been taken to, at the very least, restrict their access. Doesn't mean that they had to be walked out of the lab. But I have to say, when Dr. Gilmore was here, and I asked him what new evidence, what new information did PHAC have between the issuance of that report in July 5th of 2019, he said there was nothing more. So, very simply, would you agree at that moment their access should have been restricted?
Yes, sir, I think so.
Another issue that I find troubling was the fact that there were a number of scientists who gained access to the lab from the PRC. Two individuals who were associated with or employed with PRC institutions that CSIS determined to be working against the interests of Canada, as well as a PLA scientist whose mentor is Beijing's foremost expert in bioterrorism and biodefense. Could you comment on how it is possible that scientists with that type of connection to the Beijing regime would have the clearances or be granted access to what is supposed to be Canada's highest security lab?
Well, I think they had a very, very loose access control policy. But it goes to some of the points that I tried to make in my opening remarks. It was not just the departmental security officer or the general manager. The entire system at that point, I think, was not regarding China as seriously as we do today. So I think there's a lot of fault to go around, to put not too fine a point on it, ranging from the departmental security officer to the manager of the lab to the ADM to the deputy head and probably CSIS and the central agencies. But broadly speaking, I think they should not have been allowed that kind of access. If they were to be allowed access, it should have been a controlled access. They should have been escorted. They should have been required to wear a badge. And they should not have been allowed access to the electronic communication system.
Well, thank you. And we have heard the minister, others saying in 2018, 2019, it was a different time. And that is true to some extent. But it was not as though in 2018 or 2019 or 2017 that there weren't a lot of concerns that Canada had with the activities of the PRC. The PRC was a hostile regime at that time. Would you not agree? It was, so I just have some difficulty accepting this notion that it was such a different time in 2017 or 2018.
I think, Chair, that I understand where your colleague is coming from, but I also think next to the facts, which you've just expounded, there's this broad issue of culture. And I don't think the culture in this particular lab and in large parts of the public service had caught up with the change in facts as we understand China. So I agree, there was no sea change. There was no button push that changed things. And I think, if you're working in the bottoms of a department or of an agency, it takes a while to register these things. I'd be interested in knowing, for example, if the deputy head or her delegate had caused a note to be sent to the departmental security officer simply saying, I'm told by CSIS and everybody else, times have changed. I'm not trying to excuse what happened. I'm just saying that there's a lot of blame to go around. And it's both public service and political blame.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cooper. We'll now go to Mr. Naqvi for 6 minutes.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you very much for being here and taking the time on a Friday afternoon. I really appreciated your context-setting comments on the top of it around culture within departments. You've been in the national security business for a long, long time. I've served as both advisor to the Prime Minister in that role and as CSIS director. I wonder if you can expand on the comments you were making in terms of, in your tenures, what kind of things were CSIS or the Privy Council office was doing to change that culture in making security concerns more front of mind for department heads and others?
Good question, Chair. And I think it was very uneven, to be honest. And I want to be clear that I'm not directing this to a particular government. I'm talking about the entire time I worked. So it was both a conservative government and a liberal government. After 9/11, for example, security across the system was ratcheted up in a major way, and it impacted everyone. But since Canadians don't generally feel threatened, slowly but surely after that, we reverted to the status quo ante. PCO, the Treasury Board, CSIS regularly sent out reminders to departmental security officers. I think there was the tradition of an annual meeting and conference. But if there's not a sense globally within the public service that there's a significant issue, it's very hard to change, particularly in non-national security departments. And I don't know what you and your colleagues have concluded about the status of the lab. I think some people would argue it's a national security establishment and it should be treated as such, period. A whole bunch of other people would say it's a medical lab and, get a grip. Yes, we don't want to share with everybody in town, but it's not a national security establishment. I think the way the international environment has shifted, it's become a national security environment. I used to head the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. We had a significant component of work at that place. And at the time, that's quite a few years ago, at the time, it was not regarded as a national security institution. For a variety of reasons, security was pretty heavy, but that was because of the risk involved in all of the material that they were producing. So to go back to your question, very uneven across the years did central agencies try and remind departments to abide by the rules, to enforce them, and to push things along.
So it's very interesting what you're saying, because from other witnesses during these hearings, we've heard a similar sentiment that the nexus between science and security has been evolving, and it's far more acute today than it was even perhaps when 2018, 2019, when this particular instance was taking place. You're nodding your head, so if you can express that in words that you agree with that sentiment.
I agree.
I'm a lawyer, so I just almost want to get it enhancer. And in light of that realization, do you feel that the steps that were taken before, and I know you share some caveats, at that time were by and large appropriate? And there needs to be far better protocols in place today, given what we know up to now.
I'll give you a two-parted answer, if I may. I think a lot of the protocols today are not unreasonable. But having a protocol or having a policy is only as good as its operationalization. It's only as good as it's applied. A lot of the rules that were in place at the lab, and I confess I haven't read them all, were not unreasonable. You know, access controls, how you shipped things, not using your personal IT, those are all entirely reasonable, but it would seem they were not obeyed. So I would start from the premise that you take the rules that you have today and you take steps to ensure that they're followed. Given what you've said and what Mr. Cooper has said about an evolution in the international environment, I think they should all be reviewed and probably tightened. In particular, the use of electronic communications today, you can transmit, tetrabytes of information, in an instant. You can transfer, I think, even physically out of the labs with a little bit of effort, material that's produced there. So I would start by enforcing what we have a real look at it, and take into account the environment both of you have talked about.
My last question to you would be, you talked about the international environment. Given your experience, have you noticed similar concerns in our peer countries, perhaps Five Eyes, around culture and this evolving nexus between science and security that we're discussing?
Yes, the only one I know a little bit about is the United States. They've always taken security more serious than we do, and perhaps not without some reason. But yes, they've tightened up virtually anything relating to national security, including science.
And other countries like UK, Germany, France?
Don't know about them. The only other one I'd hesitate a view on is Australia. I think they've tightened up as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nakvi. We will now go to Monsieur Bergeron for 6 minutes.
Merci,
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Fadden, for being here today. It's the second time, unless I'm mistaken, that you've appeared before this committee, this special committee on Canada-China relations. I've retained two things from your testimony up until now, and in your answers, it's that this issue about the culture shift, that it might not have happened as quickly as would have been desirable, and the timeline. At what point did the threat become perceptible, and should we have proceeded to changes with regards to security mechanisms and a culture change within the institution itself? There's a certain amount of elements in this timeline that are interesting. In an article in the Journal de Montréal last January, we learned that since 2010, there was a report published saying that the economic growth of China and increased trust and aggressivity in recruiting suggests that China has the willingness to increase its information gathering. So the minister said when he appeared before the committee that up until 2018, we thought that it was important on a scientific level to cooperate, but that the world has changed significantly since then. Do you believe that the world changed in 2018, or should we have perceived this threat prior to 2018? Thank you. I would say before 2018. And this being said, we have to admit that relations with China are complex. The government, quite reasonably, in 2010, was trying to develop a strategic context for trade and for financial purposes, and in that context, it's hard to say at the same time we have to very concretely increase the attention that we're giving to security. Now, this being said, what I'm saying is that they had to strike a balance, but this was prior to 2018. The fact that CSIS is talking about the danger of China for 2 decades now, it's interesting, but I'm not sure what CSIS was saying to the government in general if this was being shared with Winnipeg Lab. And one of the problems with intelligence is that they have a tendency to classify things such that the distribution is complex and difficult. So I don't know to what extent departments had access to CSIS, but I would say without reserve that it was before 2018. It's quite interesting because you're saying, or you said rather, in answering to a question earlier, that at the time, the virology lab in Winnipeg had been conceived as or understood to be a health institution, and that now it has to be conceived as being a national security institution. So the change should have been made. So I come back to the 2010 report. CSIS was saying that the People's Republic of China had recourse to as many agents as non-professionals coming from the academic sector and the business sector. And now you're talking about a very interesting element. It's the issue of information sharing. With CSIS, we know that CSIS, with the CSIS Act, needs to be modified given election interference. But at the time when you were director, were concerned with this? Yes, absolutely, because we were very limited. Now, this being said, at the time, I maintained, and I still maintain, that it's possible to take a CSIS report to take out the more concerning elements with regards to sources or to protect people and to give people a general impression of the trends and concerns. And I have to say, when I was at CSIS or elsewhere, to try to deal with these types of issues with academics and scientists is not an easy task. They want to have as much detail as possible. They don't like being told by the government how to deal with things. And so we have to find a way, I think, to convince them prior to accepting a position to understand that they are working in an institution that deals with national security issues. The fact that CSIS might have had difficulty in passing on the information to the Winnipeg lab doesn't change the fact that the health department should have been receiving these reports, that public health should have received this information, and this material should have been essentially translated into a language that Winnipeg could recognize as being important, and important to the extent where regulations or rules related to safety might have been changed.
Of time, but you will have further opportunities. We'll now go to Ms. Blaney for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Chair, and I thank Mr. Faden for being here. I was reflecting as you spoke that I guess part of your retirement plan is knowing you'll be spending a great deal of time in committees with us. So thank you for your service, and thank you for the continued service in committees in the House of Commons. So I found it interesting in the short amount of testimony that you did today. You talked about national security not being consistent. Please correct me if I get anything wrong when you respond. And that obviously in some of these circumstances, people are not as worried as they could or might be. And the challenge, of course, is that there's not training and awareness, and it really must decrease across the board. And I think some of the examples that you gave as you were answering another member's question was very telling about people using personal information in a way that could be problematic. So I'm just wondering, in terms of this, how often during your term did CSIS reach out to departments and agencies to build resilience to these types of threats? And does the federal government have an established process, or is it ad hoc? You talked about it being inconsistent, so I just would like some more information on that.
We could talk about this for several hours because it's a complex question. I think information or intelligence that comes from CSIS that affects a particular department or package of departments, there would be an outreach and something would be done about it. But I think the more important question I take from your query is, what about the more general information that reflects a change in the environment? I think CSIS has a practice of distributing, there's a protocol of distributing to all departments and agency its general purpose material. part of the challenge I found, and I don't know if it's true still today, is they would have a package, since we're talking about China interference, and they would send it to the non-national security departments, and probably the deputy would send it down to the departmental security officer, and depending upon that individual, it would depend on how broadly it would be circulated. And again, I'm not trying to point fingers, it's not my objective, but if the environment is such that they don't really feel it's a threat, the DSO in Winnipeg, who gets this information, would sort of look at the environment generally, notice that nobody told him to do anything, and then would say to himself or herself, should I distribute this to all of the managers, all to the executives, or all the scientists? What do I do about it? And I think in some of the period that we were talking about before, the conclusion would have been, I ain't going to circulate it, or I ain't going to circulate it as broadly, if you'll forgive my English. So there's no magic either here or amongst our allies, to be clear. It's a general issue. When you have an intelligence agency which is built on the presumption that they have sensitive information, there's no way you can just push a button and distribute it to everybody. So you have to produce summaries, you have to talk to people. And most importantly, I mean, I've argued, I think before this committee and others, Canadians generally don't feel threatened. And that's true of large chunks of the bureaucracy. Not everybody, but large chunks of it. So if they don't feel threatened, the impetus to sort of take the kinds of reports that you've talked about and operationalize them is often not there. Not true if there's a crisis, not true if there's an emergency. But in the general peaceful period, it's like I mentioned earlier, after 9/11, let me tell you, information got circulated. But, you know, the Winnipeg lab, if you look at its history, didn't have that many major issues or crises. So there's an assumption, a human assumption, that, you know, we don't have to do maybe as much as D&D does or CSE does. Sorry, it's a long answer, but it is a complex issue.
It is a complex issue, and I think whenever you bring humanity into the fold, it always becomes a complex issue, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate your answer. And I think it also speaks to, like you talked about, building awareness across the board so that people have more. So sort of a context to make decisions from, or thoughtfulness, to even just have that thoughtfulness. And I hear what you're saying, if there's not that sort of element of fear, people lose that. It's a natural component. So I'm just wondering, from your perspective, are federal departments and agencies able to flag issues to CCs or CSIS in a timely manner? And are there barriers to that process? And is it this component of awareness? Is that the process? And, you know, with the work that you've done, do you have any advice for us about how can we maintain that awareness without sort of perpetuating fear that isn't helpful?
I think, I don't think, I know, certainly when I was there, any department or agency had a liaison officer with CSIS, and if they had any concerns, they were encouraged to raise them. And I think some did. Sometimes it was a real concern, sometimes it was not. Part of the issue I found, and I'm just reacting on giving you a personal example, is a lot of the departments and agencies didn't like to bother CSIS because they didn't think it was important enough, and sometimes it was. So it's this general issue of awareness. And I want to stress again, I'm not being partisan here. I'm not talking about Mr. Trudeau's government or Mr. Harper's government. I'm just talking about governments. Unless the Prime Minister and senior ministers signal clearly country X or issue Y is a problem that deputies can build on to send down into their departments, it's very hard to get medium-ranking and junior people to all of a sudden accept that they have an issue. I'm not saying this because I think people are stupid or ill-intended, but any very, very large organization takes a while to register these changes. And as I was saying a moment ago in response to an earlier question, for a long time, both Mr. Harper's government and Mr. Trudeau's government were trying to develop better relations with China, while at the same time we were worried, or CSIS was worried about what they were doing under the radar. And I think both governments, Mr. Harper's and Mr. Trudeau's, have shifted their views over time, which I think is a very good thing. And it reflects, I think, polling in this country. But if we're going to get everybody in government, or at least those who are in national security or national security related departments, to take this more seriously, it requires a whole of government effort, not just involving I used to joke that, I come to talk to you, Deputy Minister X. I'm not a security nut. I'm telling you that there's a problem here, and I'll tell you X, Y, Z. But if it's only the quote security nuts, that are saying there's a problem, it's an issue. You need, deputies, ministers, and others to sort of agree. And I don't believe that this has to be done in such a way, because I think that there's a real risk. We have nothing against Chinese civilization, against China and the Chinese people. So there's a balancing act there to be found, and I don't think it's easy. But I think the cultural change that we talked about a moment ago it still needs to be pursued.
Thank you, Mr. Fadden. We'll now go to Dr. Ellis for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Fadden, for being here. Apologize for not being there in person. I had a question continuing on that same vein. When Dr. Gilmore testified before the committee, he talked about cooperation with the G7 plus one, which in his mind was Mexico. Is that the type of cooperation that we need to look at going forward in a science-based environment, or is it more complex than that?
Good question. There's nothing wrong with the G7, but I think if we're going to bring together preoccupations relating to the development of science and innovation on the one hand and security on the other, I would start with NATO, which is a pretty broadly defined group of people. We forget sometimes that NATO is not just a military alliance. There are all sorts of things that NATO does, including expertise in science and technology. Nothing wrong with the G7 plus one, but we also have an issue about how we protect our own credibility in respect of a lot of these issues. And I think I would argue the better place to start would be the G7, which is, the NATO, I beg your pardon, which is most of Europe, along with associated members like Japan and Australia.
Thank you very much for that, sir. And through you, Chair, we've heard a lot of talk about the 1,000 Talent Program or talent programs in general from state actors. The question that I would have for you, sir, is what we've heard is that there appears to be an acceptability of scientists enrolled in those talent programs as long as they divulge that information to their superiors, and then they of course have the go ahead from their superior. My question is, does that seem appropriate to you? Because of course then we're relying on those scientists to be honest and say, yes, I am part of a talent program. The nefarious actors in my mind would never divulge that information. So how do we square that circle, so to speak?
I think my inclination, Chair, would be to say that the risks today are such that participation in such programs is not a good thing. I also try sometimes to equate what security is trying to do with what doctors are trying to do. You have curative medicine and preventative medicine. Curative is when you have a really big problem and you got to go in with a big mallet. But a lot of things are preventative. And I think the level of threat that we face today against China and a number of other countries is such that despite the cost to science, and there is a cost, scientists should not be allowed to participate in these talent programs with or without the permission of their superiors. If relations between ourselves and other countries, our adversaries, improve, then I think we should relook at the program. But we cannot, on the one hand, say that China, for example, is a strategic adversary, and on the other hand, say to scientists, well, as long as you report to your boss that you're talking to them, you can share virtually anything. And the problem is, in science, you can't partially share. I'm told it doesn't work. Not a scientist myself, to be clear.
Thank you for that, sir. And through you, Chair, Mr. Fadden, we know in this case that in spite of an investigation that had, by March of 31st, 2019, been going on about 10 months, at the insistence, perhaps that's a strong word, of Dr. Gilmore with CSIS, that a shipment requested by one of these scientists with, as you well know, Henipavirus and Ebola was still sent to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. In retrospect, of course, it's easier to make decisions, but was that an appropriate decision? And do you think that that should have been stopped?
I don't know about all of the rules that applied, but to the extent that I've gone through a lot of the material that your committee looked at, I think there was a rule that prohibited that, and it should not have happened. So I would argue it's not just a question of hindsight. If it was looked at the time, where it was going, the way it was transmitted, the authority it was obtained to do that, I think they violated a rule. So no, I don't think it should have happened, if I understand the rule correctly.
Thank you very much, sir. And through you, Chair, we've heard from, I don't want to turn this into a witch hunt, but we've heard from the Minister of Health that no one else should be held responsible. I'm not asking you to name names, but in my mind, there's more responsibility that should be had here, and we should investigate that a little further. Does that ring true with you, sir?
It does, and I also don't think that it's important to point names at individuals at a particular point in time. I would argue, as I tried to say at the beginning, it's the system writ large, from the very top to the very bottom, that wasn't taking these things as seriously as they should have. Now, I think you can argue that individuals within that system might have been a little bit more enthusiastic in enforcing the rules, but I think this is one of those cases where a great deal of the responsibility can be shared. I know it drives many parliamentarians to distraction when it's impossible to identify an individual in the public service who did something wrong. But in this case, I really do think it's the DSO on up. Everybody was operating in an environment where, had they thought differently, the outcome would have been different. But the environment, also, there were a lot of protections written into our system. The labor relations system, the charter and whatnot. All of these things slowed down the process that your colleague, Mr. Cooper, referred to. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but they're there. And to the extent that we want to put them into place all the time, they do have an impact.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ellis. We'll now go to Mr. Francescatos for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Fadden, for being here. In your opening remarks and in the question that you just answered, in fact, throughout your testimony, to be honest, I've been thinking about the famous quote from the noted management consultant Peter Drucker, who said that culture eats policy for breakfast every day, every single time. After this committee is done its study, there will be a report. We will put together recommendations based on witness testimony. First of all, do you have one or two key recommendations relating to this specific issue of the Winnipeg lab? And to that point, how can but do you have advice on how those recommendations that the committee puts forward that will be looked at by the bureaucracy in particular, how they can be put in place in such a way that it pushes and leads to culture change that's so obviously necessary?
Thank you, Chair. I'm probably not going to endear myself to some of my former colleagues, but in any event, if you have something like this that is a government-wide issue where responsibility for implementing is distributed across the government, the only way that you're going to get change, in my opinion, in my experience, is by accepting that it's going to take a while and having the system, the clerk with the Prime Minister, say, these two deputy ministers are responsible for ensuring that all of this is going to happen across the system. You sort of create a very, very high-level tiger team that is responsible. It appears in their annual evaluation if you want. But if you don't do something like that empowers and insists on somebody who's very senior to keep pushing on this over time, it's very, very difficult to effect change. And it's also very difficult because, we may have another major crisis of some sort in 6 months or other, and this will get pushed on the side. So my advice is very clearly articulated statement on the part of the government at the highest levels, and then the government saying to the clerk and to the Treasury Board Secretariat, we want this implemented. We want a report every 6 months or every year, and I want to know the names of two deputy ministers or agency heads who are personally responsible through a committee or whatnot for ensuring that this happens. And even with all of this, as your question implies, culture change is very hard to do. And I think probably there are 2 or 3 or 4 departments not in the core national security area that require special attention. I think it would be helpful if your committee could identify which these are and have, again, special laser-like attempt to tighten things.
Mr. Chair, I asked the question because, and we've seen it not just in Canada. It's an issue in democracies throughout that recommendations are put forward. There's a commitment that they will be implemented and there will be follow through, but culture seems to stand in the way so often of lasting change from coming to the fore. I'm going to stick on the issue of culture in the minute and a half that I have left. You said that, and I'm quoting you directly now, culture has to catch up with the facts with respect to how the Canada-China relationship has evolved, the nature of the Chinese regime under its current leadership, what that means for our national security. How can culture catch up with the facts at places like the Winnipeg lab, which you said some might view as a medical facility more than anything else, but I think you've offered a compelling view, and others have at this committee, that it is should be seen as a site of national security first and foremost.
I think identifying it clearly, somebody passes a regulation saying it's a national security establishment would be a good starting point. I think the issue is going to be that we're going to have to accept that in order for this to happen, it's going to make a lot of people unhappy. Scientists in particular really, really don't like dealing with these kinds of issues. And it means that not just in this case, senior public servants, but ministers are going to have to accept that they're going to be criticized, for, giving less priority to science or technology and whatnot. The other issue I guess I would stress, and I understand that the Minister of Public Safety is looking at this, we have to find a way of broadening access to classified information. I mean, you can take some things on faith. I think we all do. But if you're making a case that the Chinese are very interested in scientific establishments, there are ways of articulating, setting forth these examples, not just of Canada, but the UK and Germany and Australia and the United States, to show clearly that it's just not people who are worried about it in the abstract. We have to find a way of, if not declassifying, is lowering the classification a lot of these intelligence report as part of the effort to change the culture. I mean, this is not Ceausescu's Romania. We have to convince people, and we're not going to convince them, I think, without at least broadening a little bit the facts to which they have access.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pragasatos. Now we'll go to Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci encore.
Thank you. Thank you once again, Mr. Fadden, for your testimony. You raised something interesting earlier on as a member of the Committee on National Security. I know that it's possible to I know that classified information can be formulated and so that it might be made accessible to public. We do this, for example, in different cases, but also it indicates the culture change. We saw this in the reaction of the government when we were talking about sharing documents from the Winnipeg lab. And so the government closed up like an oyster. So this a culture of transparency that allows to alert the public without necessarily sharing detail of intelligence has to be implemented. When you appeared before the committee, you were evaluating the threat level of China. You said it was an 8 out of 10 in 2021. At the time when you were director of CSIS, what would you have assessed the risk represented by China at the time? 5 or 6, maybe 6? Because at the time, we were trying to find a way to have a dialogue with China. The major change that happened over the last 2 or 3 years is the arrival of Mr. Xi in China, and the president have adopted a very negative attitude towards the West. And I believe that this is where the huge change began. In your opinion, did this change begin before, or was it really the arrival of Xi Jinping? It started before, but I think that he is the one who, in English, he crystallized this. I would say that he is the one who very concretely took all the elements and made of this a national policy, but of course it did exist before Mr. Xi. In 2021, you were saying that we needed to be concerned about the functions that people occupy. And you were saying also that someone who is dealing with consular issues at an embassy, it's not a problem. It's when you're dealing with other things that it can become a problem. And would you be favorable to the creation of a register of foreign agents such as Australia did? Absolutely. There are elements that we need to look at further, and it's not, as we would say, a silver bullet, but it would be an additional tool, something that the government could use in order to try to control foreign interference by China and other countries. We already have means to deal with diplomats and people who are working in consular services, but for people who are agents of China or other countries, there's no way of identifying them. And I would even say, to go a bit further than your question, we might have to consider the possibility of creating a foreign interference crime. Right now, it's an issue when the RCMP has to find another crime that is linked to interference to be able to act. Thank you.
Ms. Blaney for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you again, Chair. My next question is just in general across the federal government, and another question alluded to this. Is there other key institutions that are at risk from foreign interference with China, from China, that we should be really alerted to?
I think it's fair to say, Chair, that China's approach to acquiring information and to interfering covers the waterfront. They are interested in governmental, strategic, critical infrastructure, technology, and information. So it really covers virtually anything except my poor example of Heritage Canada, where I don't think there's a great deal of interest. But, you know, anything that is slightly technological, research and development, that involves people who might either have or acquire influence with ministers in Parliament. So I don't really have a list in my mind, but a lot of them are, you know, agencies. I think ISED, for example, I always forget what the full name is, but ISED is probably underestimated as a source of interest by the Chinese because of all of the influence they have in issuing grants and contributions and in promoting particular parts of our economy. But anything that has anything to do with science and technology and development and people who might eventually have influence. So it's a very large chunk, I would argue. The intensity may vary, but I think there's interest.
Thank you for that. And I think that does go back to that whole part about building awareness and finding ways to connect the dots so that you can identify those issues and keep those communications open. But outside of the federal government, I mean, this is a perfect example. So do you feel that there is enough work being done in the federal government to build resilience in the key academic institutions? And, you know, as we see research growing across our country in many institutions, how are we preparing for that to maintain some security?
The short answer is no, I don't think we're doing enough. And I would expand my answer to include not just universities, but provinces as well. I don't see how we can have an effective national security environment in this country if we ignore the provinces and the private sector and civil society, because our adversaries are interested in all of them. I think that the current government, I think, is considering broadening the capacity of the public service to share information with universities and provinces and whatnot. You cannot expect these institutions to collaborate and understand the problem if we're not prepared to share some information with them. I'm not suggesting that every manager in the government of Manitoba should be given a top secret clearance, but if we're not prepared to share a little bit more than we are now, and I sit on a couple of boards, and you know, one of the complaints that they have about the federal government relates to cyber, and they keep, you know, they say the government goes and talks to them about cyber threats, but it's at a level of generality that is not helpful. We have to find a way, and I say we as a country, to share more information that's concrete and real if the universities, civil society, and the economy are going to play a part in promoting our national security.
Thank you, Ms. Blaney. Now, Mr. Fadden, do you have a hard stop, or can we impose upon you for, well, until maybe 5:10 after the hour?
We do that, Chair.
Excellent. That gives us one more complete round. 5, 5, 2.5, 2.5. We're good? Okay, excellent. Mr. Kimmich, 5 minutes for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the great advantages, I guess, of going last is I get to listen to everybody else's questions. And now, having heard all of the testimony so far, I regret not being there in person to ask you these questions and then follow up with you off camera. But there was a mention you had in your opening statement about the culture at PHAC. It was raised repeatedly by other members that there's kind of a complacency culture that exists in some of the non-security agencies regarding foreign interference, foreign campaigns by other governments to obtain data and information. The feeling I get, having heard all the testimony so far, especially from officials and the health minister when he came before committee, is twofold. It's the Leslie Nielsen defense, the house is on fire, nothing to see here, everything is good, that meme that exists online. And the second one, when I was listening to some of the officials that you've pointed out, the DSOs and above, say basically the Sir Humphrey Appleby defense. Many lessons were learned and we won't do as badly next time. But how can a culture change if nobody's held accountable? And I don't mean necessarily people are fired, but demotions and very openly pointing fingers at individuals who should be held accountable for rules that weren't followed or for complacency in the workplace. So how can the culture change if nobody is held accountable, is my question to you, sir.
That's a very good question, I think, Chair. I think changing the culture will involve far more than that, but I take your point. One of the difficulties we have in this country of holding anybody accountable is that you can't talk about it publicly. You know, the Privacy Act is very, very strict, and there are good reasons for it. I think that if you're able to identify in a particular time frame positions that could have been, who had responsibilities which could have been discharged better, that's one way of doing it. But accusing somebody of doing something wrong in the lab without the possibility of a real investigation, of appeals and whatnot, is very, very difficult. I really do believe that in this case there are so many people who played on this file and did not do what they might have done that it's going to be hard to say it's this person, and that person. But I think it's something that the public service, eventually with ministers, they should look at whether or not it should be possible publicly to make the point without destroying a person's reputation. You know, everybody, for as long as I've been a public servant, this has been an issue. You know, and many politicians have suggested to me it's driven them to distraction, that there's never a public servant held accountable. So I was talking to people in the private sector. Well, you know what they do when somebody really does something wrong? They give them a very large check and they go away. Nobody ever talks about it. I'm exaggerating, but there's some truth in that. We can't do that in the public service. So what we do is we shuffle people, or they're reproved, or if they're an executive, their executive compensation is reduced and whatnot. But if we're not prepared to talk about it, at least to some degree, and I would limit the degree publicly, it's not going to work. Because it's an example that we have to get out. If people don't know that something negative can happen, you're right, it's going to be very hard to change the culture, although I would prefer to use the carrot in changing the culture to the extent possible, because as I said, we're dealing with very smart, highly educated people, and if we don't bring them along, it's going to be an uphill battle.
So, Mr. Chair, my follow-up question then would be when there was discussion about what types of recommendations we could put together, there was mention of a committee being formed of public servants across government with potentially 2 deputy ministers selected to be responsible at the end of the day for overseeing it. So my question to Mr. Fadden is, how would you see that working, and what would be the accountability mechanisms to make sure that if this happens again, and this is government after all, so I expect there'll be future parliamentarians having the same maddening discussion around this table at some future point, how can we hold public servants accountable if and when something like this happens again, or if we discover this has happened elsewhere in government? What would these deputy ministers be doing? What would this committee be functioning? What would be the accountability mechanism?
Thank you, Chair. In the first instance, I would say that my idea of having a couple of deputy ministers would be to ensure operationalizing those recommendations of this committee that the government has accepted. In other words, my understanding is that you will make a report to Parliament. The government will then have to decide which components and whether or not they are accepted. I would then say you take whatever the government decides on, they clearly tell the public service, the clerk, the Treasury Board, that we want these things done within the following time frame. And my experience suggests to me that if you just tell all deputy ministers to do this, it doesn't always work evenly. So you appoint a champion, an implementation champion. Maybe it's a deputy secretary in PCO. I don't know who it is. And you simply say to them very clearly, he or she has to establish a time frame for implementing all of these various recommendations. And you have to report back to, I guess, a committee of cabinet and perhaps a committee of parliament. And in doing that, I think it becomes easier to find out what's going on. You know, you can insist that the Treasury Board mandate audits. You know, you don't have to have a problem before you mandate an audit. One of your colleagues asked a question about, you know, which departments and agencies should we worry about from a security perspective? Well, why doesn't the Treasury Board do 3 audits a year, just looking at what the DSOs are doing on these departments? That's not punitive, it's preventative. But if they find problems, it's possible to then require the deputy head to do something about it. I wouldn't be surprised if the Auditor General did something like this at some point as well.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to Ms. Lalonde for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fadden, and thank you for your attendance and certainly your service to Canada yourself. So we've talked, and you talked particularly about culture, evolutions, also the fact that the economic access over the years by government in terms of moving forward with China's relationship and the possibilities. I would like to hear you maybe telling us a little bit, based on your former role, what is the role actually that CSIS does play in protecting Canada's research and the intelligence component?
Thank you, Chair. Well, CSIS fundamentally is an information gathering institution. It's something that we tend to forget. We sometimes think that there's a James Bond element where people sort of, you know, swoop in and fix things. Fundamentally, it's an information gathering information. It takes that information and it analyzes it and it distributes it. I would argue, and I would say the same thing about when I was there, I don't think we did a good enough job to vulgariser, to make more generally available the information in language that people understand. The main role that CSIS plays is informing government about issues that arise. They have no executive power. They have no powers of compulsion. All they can do is, if necessary, pound a little bit on the table and ask that people take their views seriously. So I think if you're going to focus on CSIS and their role in protecting, I think it's important to understand that their role is to inform and sometimes to prod, but they don't have much more of a role than that. It really then becomes the job of departments and agencies to find those parts of the intelligence that they feel needs to be acted upon.
Thank you very much. And maybe we didn't touch too much on that, so I would like to hear a little bit about how can actually the government protect Canada's research institutions from the threats through AI and cyber attacks from by foreign hostile actors. And I would like to hear more about even a recommendation that could lead to some of your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll go back a little bit, Mr. Chair, to what I said a little bit earlier. I think if you're going to deal with the private sector, research and development areas, you know, passing legislation or regulations is not going to make a huge difference. You have to convince these people that there's a real risk. And the only way that we're going to do that is if we share information with them and we bring them to some degree within the tent. I know CSE makes a significant effort to try and explain to corporations and whatnot the dangers of cyber. But when we compare what we do to the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, we're still very reticent about what we share with the private sector. So, sure, change the rules if you have to, require reporting on cyber attacks, require basic measures to be taken. But no large corporation is going to significantly shift its investment pattern, for example, if it's not convinced itself that there's a real risk that its R&D will be stolen, that its IP will be stolen. So we have to find a way, I think, of bringing them along more than we have now. And I'm repeating myself and I apologize, but we're simply not able, we as a country, we don't share enough information with the private sector. I mean, one of my political masters once told me when we were talking about sharing information, national security is to be dealt with, not talked about.
I'm just in my room. We're just got about,
That view still permeates chunks of the community. I'm not sure what that was. Was that a cyber attack?
No. I think it's an unmuted member of parliament that sometimes happens, and I apologize for that. So I just want to hear you maybe very quickly. I'm the parliamentary secretary of national defense, and as you know, everything is classified, needs lie level, and certainly when you talk about industry, and one person was just reflecting on the fact that here in Canada, a lot of our industry, and I'll say maybe on the defense side, but I think more broadly from what I understand from you, is that they don't have that clearance, and we have restricted ourselves to talk to these individuals in finding solutions. Would you recommend then that possibly some of the industries should elevate their status of that enhanced security clearance, or is the opposite? We should ourselves change a little bit of our system to accommodate that sharing of information?
I think in the final analysis, Chair, the government would have to change its rules in order to permit members of the private sector to be security cleared, and then impose some conditions on them for those of them who receive specialized clearances. And I want to stress, though, that from my perspective, at any rate, this doesn't mean that every manager in every defense industry gets a security clearance. It just means that key personnel who are involved in immediate issues with the Defense Department would have probably not even a top secret clearance, but you can do a heck of a lot with a secret clearance. So we would have to change our rules to make it possible for them to receive the clearance and then impose conditions on how they deal with that information once they've been security cleared.
Thank you, Ms. Lalonde. Mr. Bergeron, you have now 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. In 2021, you were saying that the Chinese authorities are absolutely determined to reach their objectives, regardless of what we think. And what I find concerning is that they're prepared to use almost any method to reach their goals, and we can't do that here in Canada. And in the West, we can't do that in general. And you were saying that one of the challenges that we're facing in Canada is that of understanding what we're going to do if we accept this idea that countries such as China present a risk. Here's my question. 3 years later, do you have the impression that we've now understood that countries such as China represent a risk? And if yes, do you think that we have begun to implement the necessary tools to allow us to protect ourselves against this risk? I think, Mr. Chair, that we've made progress. And this has been aided with the difficulties we've had with regards to the two Michaels. If we look at polls with regards to the period following the two Michaels issue, the attitude of Canadians towards China is increasingly negative. So this was a start. And so where we don't see China as being not at all an adversary. So I believe that we've made progress, but are we now at the level where most Canadians accept that China is truly an adversary? It's not an enemy. Well, our close allies, the US, the UK, France, consider China as being a strategic adversary, such as Russia. So I would say, in summary, that it's better than it was, but, for example, we're probably the only Western country where we don't have a policy, a foreign policy on this, and we would be able to clearly state the position of the Government of Canada is that China constitutes, well, it's true that the Indo-Pacific strategy has within that strategy a few paragraphs indicating that there's a change of the government attitude with regards to China. But it's not something that the Government of Canada or Canada has overtly indicated that we have a serious adversary. I'm repeating myself. I think we've made progress, but not enough.
Has expired.
C'est trop dommage. Merci infiniment, Monsieur Fadden.
Ms. Blaney, 2.5 minutes for you.
Well, thank you, Chair. And again, Mr. Faden, this was a very helpful session, and I appreciate your time. I know that one of the things that is really concerning me is that Canadians are starting to question a lot of our processes. And we know that when that mistrust grows, it can be very detrimental to our communities and to our nation. We know that in this context, it took years to resolve the issue, and that's, in my opinion, not the best time frame. So I'm just wondering, you did talk earlier about working with provinces, territories, academic institutions, and private institutions in terms of giving a little bit more information. What mechanisms do we need? And how can we take those mechanisms, do the work, but also have a way of sharing it with Canadians to build that sense of faith and trust?
Thank you, Chair. I think going back to my point that doing this doesn't mean sharing, giving everybody in the country security clearances. I would go about it using a sectoral approach. For example, the banking industry, the financial industry, they have an association. You develop a memorandum of understanding with them that certain of their members are given security clearances, and they find a way of distributing this information in a non-classified way with their membership. Simply going out and, it's sort of like, to use it, using another medical analogy, but fighting against cancer is not helpful. You have to fight the specific kind of cancer. So just sort of saying we're going to clear all Canadians is not helpful. We have to find a way of narrowing the number of people and the number of institutions that we're talking about. I think the Government of Canada has 13, I may be wrong, 13 critical industries, critical infrastructure industries. So pick 3 or 4 of those, nuclear, financial, oil and gas, I have forgotten what they are, and develop an understanding with them that we're going to be a little bit more open than we are now and see where we can go from there. And then start spreading that out beyond the private sector with maybe the Canadian Association of Universities. But going to a particular university and to a particular collection of professors and giving them security clearances alone, I'm not sure it would work in the short term. What I'm trying to say is I don't think there's a silver bullet.
Thank you.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of our time. We appreciate the extra time you spent with us, Mr. Fadden. I think that there's at least one other committee and maybe more that owe us lunch for the work that you've done here because they've really covered some very good ground. And I want to remind everybody, our substitutes, that we will be looking at drafting instructions for this study on Monday. So you may wish to, switch out at least for that portion of the meeting so that you can provide your input to the analysts. But with that, I want to thank everybody for their time today. Excellent questions, excellent testimony. Thank you to the staff and the clerks and everybody, our analysts. Meeting adjourned.